There was one instance where some officers where I asked them about, when do you make an arrest with somebody who might be undocumented, or if somebody's ever undocumented, does that enter into your mind when you have to make an arrest for whatever reason? And they said, no, not really. And then I asked them, well, there's been a lot of people being arrested and then they end up deported. So I'm really curious, here we are driving around in an immigrant community. What goes on here? Is there any sort of department policy to arrest for certain violations or just give citations for other violations? And one of the officers mentioned a policy. He didn't specify when it occurred, and it seemed like it was nothing official or written. It was more of a verbal emphasis that the command was encouraging the patrol officers to do. But there had been, according to his story, a number of leaving the scene collisions, LTS collisions, where there'd be an accident and then people would take off, either leave the wrecked vehicle and depart the scene, or hit something and then leave the scene in the vehicle. And it seemed to be occurring in areas that were the main demographic or immigrants. And so he explained to me that in those areas, that if you pull somebody over and they didn't have a license and didn't have insurance, then an arrest would be made for that, with the intention that would send a signal to people not to flee the scene, to stay there and interact with the cops and explain to them what was happening. And so the way it was explained to me is a preventative approach. If people start getting arrested for doing something like leaving the scene, then eventually that should translate into people realizing they can't leave the scene. But there's a lot of questions of perhaps it backfired. Did it lead to more people being arrested? And then because of the participation with ICE, and because of the neighborhoods and the communities that they were from with their citizenship status, that they were inadvertently and unintentionally on the side of law enforcement, led to their deportation. And then when that happens, then the family members of somebody who was arrested and then deported, then they have a story of how the local law enforcement were directly, even though unintentionally involved in the deportation of a wife or a husband or boyfriend or child. And so there's this complicated element of law enforcement trying to make things safer by pushing through a policy or a practice meant to encourage people not to leave the scene, but the repercussions of that are perhaps the opposite, where rather than improving public safety, there's always the danger that it could undermine public safety by creating greater fear. And that's something that is really hard to substantiate, but it's a really significant story there. And it's one that partially answers the paradox of how people can be being deported en masse when there's not a bureaucratic or police emphasis on hunting down immigrants. The police are really just doing their job, and they're doing a good job at it, but it just so happens that doing the job in the context of the collaboration with ICE is creating a lot of issues on the side of immigrants with their trust and willingness to talk to the police. And that's something that's been systematically substantiated in all of our interviews and focus groups in the immigrant communities.